I'm Lannan, he's Giles, and this is Lannan and Giles Unscripted. And today is the 18th day of July in 2025. I'm Larry Lannan, Duncan Giles. Welcome back.
Thanks, Larry. It's always good to be here.
Well, I guess one thing about Indianapolis, where you and we both live in the Indianapolis area, the WNBA All-Star Game is coming to Indianapolis the day after we record this. And you said, I think one reason that Indianapolis was awarded this is because Caitlin Clark plays for Indianapolis, the biggest star that has put the WNBA on the map, I think. There's a lot of other issues going on, but I think that the big issue that we have to talk about now is the fact that Caitlin Clark is getting beat up a lot. I think there's a bit of jealousy amongst the other players that she's getting all this attention, although they're all benefiting from it. It doesn't always work out that way. And she got injured again. So she will not be able to play in this big all-star game where she kind of was expected to be the center of attention, which is a bit sad.
Yeah, it really is. She's a great player. I think the WNBA is a great league, and I'm glad that they've had great stars in the past and great players, and having her in the league now has shown a brighter spotlight on it to bring more attention to it, which I think is fantastic. And yeah, there's definitely some animosity among several players. Um, we won't mention any by name, injuries, that have are upset about the attention she gets. And my fear is, and I was thinking about this just the other day, with the way that she's getting injured and things of that nature, she's such a wonderful talent. I hope she doesn't end up like a Pete Maravich, who was, back in the day, a awesome basketball player, could shoot the lights out from anywhere, anything of that nature, but injuries absolutely derailed his career. And I'm hoping that injuries don't do the same for her. The treatments are much better now than they were in the late 60s, early 70s when Pistol Pete played. But, she is such a transcendent player. I don't want injuries to have to dim her career. I hope that she can continue to go on because it's a great thing for Indianapolis. It's a great thing for the WNBA. And, the longer career that Caitlin has, I think it's the better for everybody, including her.
I think Colleen Brennan is a great journalist who's covered a lot of women's sports, has just released a book on Caitlin. And she's been doing a book tour and talking pretty bluntly about this whole issue about jealousy, which I'm anxious to read the book. I haven't got it. I'm reading another book right now, but I'm going to get to that eventually. And also the WNBA, to be quite honest with you, Duncan, for years did not have the highest quality of play. It just wasn't. It was a new league, and they just were kind of getting their legs under them. And the quality of play for people who love basketball wasn't that great at the beginning, but it was getting better before Caitlin Clark got there. And I think now that Caitlin brought attention to the WNBA, more basketball fans are watching it and seeing the high level of play these women are at. And
I'll agree to disagree with you there because I think the Sue Storms, the Deanna Taurasi's, um, you know, uh, all of the great Asia Park, the great players that have been there. This league has been playing great basketball for several years. Admittedly, when it first started, it was rough, but I think for a long time it's been good basketball. So we'll just
it really,
agree to disagree.
well, the last few years have been better, and I just not that they didn't have great individual stars. They just the team play has improved greatly in the last few years. We can disagree on that, I guess. But let's get started with our news stories that did not necessarily get big media attention over the last week, and I'll let you start, Duncan.
Yeah, my first story is going to be about our Health and Human Services Secretary, RFK Jr., who declared before Congress that basically we're going to be looking at psychedelics to treat things like depression, bipolar, things of that nature. Um, you know, it's one thing to treat it, and there have been several groups that have said, "Hey, we need to do more of this." And RFK Jr. is a huge believer in it. I'm fine with this if it is properly tested and vetted. decent studies. Let's have the clinical things going on. We need to know what's going on. But, the Institute on Drug Abuse funded preliminary studies on using it. They discontinued it after it identified as a cardiovascular toxicity. And some of the studies that have been done have been not really vetted by the regular scientific community. Some of the conclusions they reached were, let's say, dubious. And, one of the things that they talk about there, and this was very buried in a story about this, the FDA is interested in psychedelics, including ibogaine, and it's funding an American drug maker's work to develop a safer synthetic version of it. But we have to be very mindful not to fall into the hype and to be objective and rigorous in evaluating them. And from what we're hearing from the secretary, that's not going to be the case. And that greatly worries me, because this is something that really needs to be tested before it's prescribed for people for these illnesses, to me.
Yeah, I mean, RFK Jr., I mean, it's his own family that basically said he shouldn't have the job he has now. And the other thing I would say is that his problem and my problem with what he does and his approach to a very important job in the federal government is that he tends to discount treatments and medications that have gone through the testing and seems to promote those that haven't. And unfortunately, this is one of those examples. I have a story that I didn't make a lot of it splash on media, and I think it needs to be highlighted. It's an issue that's been going on for years, and it's getting worse. A new study has been released, which is considered to have been a study with legs under it, a good study, that finds that severe obesity in children among the United States, within the United States, has tripled since 2008. The sharpest increase are in adolescent teenagers and in black children, sadly. 23% of all children, think about that, 23% of all children in the United States are now considered obese, and the extremely severe cases of obesity have gone up
Oh,
250% in 15 years.
oh,
So, when you have this obesity problem as a young person, it tends to follow you in adulthood unless you drastically change your lifestyle. And I think the big issue here is why. How is this happening and why it's happening? And that's still, we don't have good data on that. We just know it's a problem. We know it's a big problem, and how to attack it, I think, is an issue. I think there's some people in the past who have tried to deal with this, have promoted healthy eating, promoted exercise. I didn't always eat well, but I was out running and playing sports. I wasn't very good at sports, but I love going out and playing sports. And I think just going out and playing sports is helpful for you to keep you healthy. So, and I think my parents did try to give me healthy food to the extent they could. So, Duncan, I think the big issue here is we know it's a problem. It's getting worse. What do we do about it now?
yeah. I think part of that is the age in which we live in. Everybody's connected by, their smartphones or things of that, tablets, things of that nature. Back when we were younger, we're both boomers. I went the tail end of the boomer. It was like, okay, go outside, and I don't want to see you until it's time to go home. Until it gets dark. Our parents didn't know where we were for hours, but we were out running around, riding our bikes, doing a touch football, or whatever, or doing a baseball type thing. Whatever we were doing activities outside. And this is greatly lessened for several reasons. Like I said, technology is one. Fear of predators, which is actually very real, is another. You don't want to, leave the kids out of your sight too long, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that there needs to be more healthy eating, and this is actually, do as I say, not as I do, because my body system, as people that know me will know that I say, if I eat fruits or vegetables, my body starts to go, what is this? It starts to reject them. My motto is better living through chemicals. Let me take the supplements. But that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is proper eating, eating the proper foods, getting that sort of thing, and then getting some sort of exercise. I think that'll help. Will that eliminate all the root causes? Absolutely not. But I got to believe it would help.
Yeah, I mean, I've lost about 15, 20 pounds here in the last few months. I've taken some new medications. I feel a whole lot better with less weight on me, but to each their own. But I think the important thing is finding the issues when people are young. If you choose to not eat well when you're an adult, you're an adult. You make your own decisions. But as a child, I would hope that, we take a look at why this is happening and how we might be able to fix that. Duncan, you have a second story.
Yeah, my second story today comes from an article in the medical journal of the Lancet, excuse me, on June 30th. And basically, they did an analysis of if the USA, United States Agency for International Development, and the consequences of its dismantling as the Trump administration wants to do. And I'm going to throw some numbers out here. The study concluded that from 2001 to 2021, 20 years, programs funded by USAID prevented nearly 92 million deaths in 133 countries. Think about that. Prevented 92 million deaths. It estimates that the cuts that the current administration wants to do, has made for USAID, will result in more than 14 million deaths in the next 5 years. About 4.5 million of those will be children under 5. So, I understand the America first, and we don't want to, we want to take care of the people at home, absolutely. But, we've created this. We have this obligation out there, and to just cut it cold turkey like this is going to be a real world implication, and I don't think that's been reported on enough.
Well, I think the big issue here, there are two big issues. One is that we are allowing people to die. The United States,
Yep.
as always, and we are the richest country in the world, and there are those who say we have a certain responsibility worldwide because of that, and that we have done those programs because we feel we have that responsibility. Well, now if the decision is going to be made to pull that, first of all, you'll see the results, which Duncan just gave the numbers, and they're scary. But the second thing is, we have always in the United States felt we have the importance of soft power. In other words,
Well
we're
said.
helping you because we are a wealthy nation. We believe our system of government and our whole system is better than that of the Chinese, for example. But it's the Chinese who will benefit from this because they will step in and they
Yep.
will do it. Now, what are these third world and other countries going to think when they try to figure out how in the future to form their government, their economic system? They're going to look to China. They're not going to look to the United States. So this has real world implications. So I appreciate that, Duncan.
Well said. Yep.
Uh, I think we're being too serious here. So I got to have our final one a little on the lighter side because there's a woman in Washington State who has just earned a Guinness World of Records. She's now in the book of World Records for Guinness. She has a collection of over 4,060 to be exact, different jigsaw puzzles. That's right, over 4,000 different jigsaw puzzles. Her name is Liza Fireman. She's age 46. She lives in Bellevue, Washington, and she told Guinness that she started collecting these puzzles in 2019. And over that time, she has accumulated all of these, over 4,000 of them, and mostly from one manufacturer called Ravensburger. Now, why is that important? I'm not a big aficionado of puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, but if you are, you would know that Ravensburger is like the gold standard of jigsaw puzzles. They're like the very best in the world. So it's not only does she have a long 4,000 plus of them, she has the highest standard of them. And now that 4,060 makes her the largest collector of jigsaw puzzles in the world. She broke the record of a man by the name of John Walzak. He had about 2,000, and that was his record from 2023. So this Liza Fireman has doubled the previous world Guinness World Book of Records, however you put that. And she loves Disney puzzles. She likes the puzzles themed on the TV series Friends, James Bond films, Hello Kitty, the movie Wicked. So she has her favorites, but she's got over 4,000 jigsaw puzzles. I can't even imagine that, Duncan.
4,000 puzzles in 6 years.
Yes.
That's a dedication right there. I'm not sure dedicated to what, but that is a dedication and a well-deserved record. And for those who don't realize it, the Guinness Book of World Records, and this was started by the Guinness Beer Company, was huge in the 70s and 80s. Was just huge. It was a huge thing to be in this world record book, and they used to print it out and things of that nature. So for her to have that certified by Guinness is actually a pretty big deal, because you get some unique items in there, and I would say this is one of those.
You know, I worked in radio broadcasting for years, and when you do a morning show, that's like the big show, the big audience show in radio. I think it still is, like what they call morning drive. People get up in the morning, if they're not watching TV, they'll listen to the radio as they're getting ready. You have to sit and watch it or stand and watch a TV screen, but the radio is in the background while you're doing other things or driving to work. And every morning personality I ever knew had that book, Guinness Book of World Records, because they always had something in there that they could stick into their show. It was
Yep.
entertaining. Let's move on to our main issue, Duncan. And our main issue today is something that has been a pet project for me ever since I studied political science in college in the 1970s. That's financing campaigns, political campaigns. There's an old quotation from a man named Jesse Unruh, who was, I think, the Speaker of the California House years ago, who once said that money is the mother's milk of politics. And he said that a long time ago. I don't think even he could imagine what has been happening ever since the Watergate era in the United States. If you study Watergate, you've talked about all the presidents, man, the book and the movie. If you look at that, a lot of the campaign finance issues came because there was a law that was passed in 1971, the Federal Election Campaign Act, that put some restrictions and reporting rules in place. And if you remember, in that book and that movie, people who were contributing to the Nixon campaign in 1972 were urging their donors to get their campaign, particularly the cash campaign contributions, in before that law kicked into place.
Yep.
And so that was the first effort by the Congress to establish limits, disclosures. This actually was the beginning of political action committees, which at that time the Congress had no idea what they would become.
Right.
But that was the idea, was to put limits and to monitor it and make it a more honest system. Well, we saw what happened with Watergate. So after Watergate in 1974, there were some major amendments that were made to that law. And was basically a response to Watergate. It put very strict limits on the following: limits on individual contributions to candidates, limits on candidates' spending from their own personal funds, and limited total campaign expenditures. I thought it was a good law, and I thought it was a law that did what needed to be done, and it did create the Federal Election Commission. Now, the Federal Election Commission was established as a bipartisan group. And to do so, they had an even number of people from each party. Democrats, Republicans had an even number. They thought there would be some unanimity in wanting to have an honest system. Wrong. Federal Election Commission is basically a neutered agency because every vote of any consequence they make is a tie. Democrats and Republicans vote their own way. And so the Federal Election Commission, it exists, it has a staff, they try to do the best they can, but the commission itself has trouble making important decisions. But after the 1974 law, here come the court decisions, and that's where things really started to to get mucked up, if you will. In 1976, the Supreme Court came in with a ruling on a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. It did some good and bad things. It upheld the limits on individual contributions to candidates, but it struck down something else. It struck down limits on candidates spending their own personal money in their campaigns. And what did they cite as the reason for that? They cited the First Amendment free speech provision. So, what the Supreme Court was essentially saying was that money, the amount of money you have, can be converted into the amount of free speech you're allowed to have. You know, the more money, the more speech you get, which I always thought was a flawed decision. That decision
Absolutely.
is still there, and I think very flawed. I don't care, you know, whether you're a conservative or a liberal. The amount of money you have should not dictate how much political speech you're allowed to have, and that is essentially what the Supreme Court said in Buckley. I still think we're going to talk about Citizens United in a minute.
Yeah.
Vote to.
But Buckley started that ball rolling. Yep.
To me, Buckley was much more damaging to the system of financing campaigns, in my personal view. Others have other views. That's my view. Now, it did also make an important distinction between contributions and expenditures. Contributions can be regulated, but expenditures are protected speech. And that's another big loophole created by Buckley. So Buckley began the system we have seen today, Duncan. I mean, I talk a moment about that because I'm going to talk about Citizens United later, but I think Buckley was the one that really created the nasty system we have today.
It did. It really was. It's the framework for everything that we've had when the Supreme Court allowed the Buckley decision and went forward with it to basically start that. And like you pointed out, the more money you have, the more freedom of speech that you're entitled to when it comes to political matters is just something that I think the founding fathers, who a lot of the Supreme Court will go back to and saying, you know, we're strict constitutionalists, we follow the founding fathers. I think once they heard that decision, they were like rolling over in their graves. They're like, no, 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 no. And these were moneyed people who did frame the Constitution. These were moneyed landowners. But I think they would take a look at that and say, oh, this is not what we intended at all.
Well, yes, in many states, when we first became a nation, we became a democracy, a democratic republic, if you will.
Yep.
You had to own land to vote. I mean, we've emerged from that, but that even with that system, I think these men would say, "Really, your money and your did we really mean that when we wrote this Constitution?" Then we get into the 1980s and 90s, and the loopholes really began to widen, and that a phrase we still hear today, soft money, started. Yep. And what soft money, it sort of said, I'm trying to put this in as simple a terms as I can. It allows you to make unlimited contributions for what's called party building, political party building, indirectly supporting candidates, which even though they say indirectly can kind of be directly, actually. So soft money began in 1996. There was a case, Colorado Republican Federal Campaign Committee versus Federal Election Commission. And there, the court ruled parties can spend unlimited funds independent of a candidate. Can't coordinate with the candidate, but you can still trash the other side. And that's where we really get into huge, huge loopholes.
Yeah, can't coordinate with the candidate. Sure, there's no coordination.
Well, you and I were involved with the federal government, and we saw soft money and how that was used, and I think abused in some cases. Then we go to the 2000s, turn of the century. Here's a law people remember. It's called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, but it really isn't known by most people. It's known as McCain-Feingold. John McCain, a conservative Republican, Russ Feingold, a liberal Democrat. But they had common ground. They both felt that the campaign finance system was corrupted, and they wanted to change it. And he'd worked for years, and in 2002, they finally got this law passed, the McCain-Feingold Act. What did that do? Banned this soft money to national political parties, regulated what are called electioneering communications, issue ads close to an election, which really can sway an election. And it raised the contribution limits with inflation. So rather than put a contribution limit that's just there, it would be tied to inflation, which made sense to do that. Here come more court decisions after that law was passed. Law passed in 2002. Didn't take long. 2003, McConnell versus Federal Election Commission. Now, in that case, the Supreme Court did uphold much of McCain-Feingold, but then they came back in 2007 and started to narrow it. Federal Election Commission versus Wisconsin Right to Life is the case. And the narrowing of McCain-Feingold was this. It allows issue ads unless they were express advocacy for or against a candidate, which opened up a gigantic loophole a Mack truck could go through.
Yep. Yep.
Duncan, do you think that was another big opening of a hole? McCain-Feingold did good work, but then the court opened this gigantic loophole.
Yeah, that's the thing. Anytime that, and the Supreme Court likes to say that they don't get into political, they want to follow the Constitution, things of that nature. You see things like this where a good law is passed, and then, for lack of a better term, activist judges want to say, no, we're going to narrow this, or, we're going to interpret it our way, even though the originators of it both said, no, this is not the way that we intended it to work. This is not what Congress voted on. Supreme Court said, well, we disagree. We think it's this way. And so you sit there and just go, what? Okay.
Well, and I think that we need to be a little bit skeptical of anybody who talks about activist judges, because what they're really saying is the judges are ruling against them.
Yeah.
It doesn't
Yeah.
matter which side you're on, they're activist if they rule against you. So, I mean, that's just always be a little skeptical when you hear that from either side, any side. Well, now we're going to get into the 2010s, and here comes Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. What did that case do? Well, it allowed corporations and unions to spend unlimited money on independent political expenditures. My God, that's a loophole bigger than a Mack truck, all right? That allowed gigantic loopholes in that McCain-Feingold law. And that created the legal framework for super PACs. Now, it got energized here in a moment, but super PACs could be created under Citizens United, but how they were funded was a little unclear. Well, there was another case that came that same year called SpeechNow.org versus Federal Election Commission. This is an appeals court ruling from the D.C. Circuit, but it still stands today. What that ruling says, individuals can make unlimited contributions to groups that only make what are called independent expenditures. Oh my gosh. What this created was a way to fund these super PACs that were the framework legally was put together by Citizens United, but people forget SpeechNow.org. That case against Federal Election Commission created the wherewithal to fund these super PACs. So this is how extremely, extremely wealthy people control the political system, or at least have the ability to do so. Then in 2014, there was another case, McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission. It struck down the aggregate limit on how much individuals can contribute. People don't realize that was a major decision to, again, unleash all this big money going into political campaigns. But it left intact base limits, but they really didn't have a whole lot of impact because now you got that aggregate limit struck down. That really Katie barred the door after that. So do you think, Duncan, that series of cases, starting with Citizens United going to McCutcheon, that largely created the system we see today?
Yeah, and that totally wrecked any intent of McCain-Feingold bill. I absolutely did. And again, as we said, that was bipartisan, just trying to reform the system. And I still go back to Mitt Romney answering a question about campaign financing when it came to Citizens United. Corporations are people too, my friend. And it's like, okay, no, this is a total abrogation of what we should be looking at, what we should be doing. And I mean, you take a look at it today. How much are these campaign contributions coming in? How much are these people raising for jobs, let's say in the Congress, that pay under $200,000 a year? How much are they raising? They're raising money for school board positions that maybe pay a per diem, don't even pay salaries. It's taken all this and it's corrupted the system. Is like you said, people with a lot of money absolutely can control the political process. Um, we're seeing a lot of it happen today and in the past couple of elections. And I would hope that someday, hopefully in my lifetime, that the people will be able to take the process back and make it a better system than the one we have now, where if you raise the most money, chances are you're going to be the one that's going to be the one that's elected, even if you're not the best candidate.
There's something that's happened. You and I were in tax law for years, studied tax law, and 501c is the section of the federal tax code that deals with nonprofit organizations. People are most familiar with 501c3s, where they're charitable. You make a contribution, you at least have the potential to have a charitable contribution deduction. But there's another section of 501c, 501c4. And what that did is create entities where you can spend money on political activity without disclosing the donors. So you can
Yep.
anonymously uh, support a political or set up political campaigns without even naming yourself or your corporation or whatever entity is contributing to that. There's a term for that. It's called dark money.
Yep.
There's a journalist called Jane Mayer who works for the New Yorker magazine, has written a book and has written extensively on this issue. If you want to know more about that, look at her writing because she has looked into that. And that is another aspect that has evolved with all these court decisions. Now, some of the states have tried to put limits on that, places like New York City, Seattle, the city, but they're doing the best they can. But this is a national problem. We'll more than likely need a national solution if we ever get one. And if you want to look at any possibility of change, there is a bill that's been in the Congress called the For the People Act. There's
Yeah.
another one called the Disclose Act that deals with the 501c4s. And Congress has been gridlocked on this issue for a long time. And one party or the other usually has enough people defecting, even if one's for it, there's enough defecting that it just can't get through. It just cannot get through that gauntlet of the Congress. But if you want any hope for the future, look at how your political candidates for federal office, what position are they taking on this? I think you just need to consider that. It doesn't matter what their party, because John McCain was a pretty conservative Republican. And, he was the one who started the system that the courts eventually whittled away, that McCain-Feingold bill. So now I've seen a lot of very conservative politicians and Republicans in favor of some real reform here. So it's not one party or the other, I don't
Right.
think. You need a consensus amongst the political parties to make a change. Any final view on this, Duncan?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, association that we've both been with, and I very much intertwined and will be until the rest of my days. National Treasury Employees Union has their own political action committee, TPAC, Treasury Employees Political Action Committee. No dues ever go towards this. And when you talk to leaders, whether it be Colleen Kelly, whether it be Tony Reardon, whether it be Doreen Greenwald, they all say, we hate having to do this. We hate having to have this. But we are trying to combat the false messages that are getting out that are denigrating other things that are being funded at hundreds of times more to do this. So it's there's always going to be money in politics. There has been ever since we've been a democratic republic, but it needs to be more controlled. We have lost all control, and we definitely need to see some of these bills pass in a bipartisan fashion so that we can take more control of our political process and not leave it to the oligarchs of the world, uh, especially here in the United States, but in other countries as well that are funding candidates to try and bring it more for the people.
Even if you're against the current system, unilateral disarmament doesn't work. So even if you're against
Yeah,
it, you
well
still have to
said.
political action committee, whatever side you're on, whatever you happen to be, uh, whatever you're trying to push as an organization or a person. Okay, we're into our Critics Corner segment of the podcast. So, Duncan, what's your Critics Corner item this week?
We recently, my beautiful and awesome wife Kim and I recently finished up the series Jack Ryan on Amazon Prime. A little late to the party, but we watched all 4 seasons of it. A lot of times I like to wait for everything to finish so we can just stream it all at once. Um, it's a lot different than the books. There's some similarities, but there are an awful lot of differences. Jack Ryan who's played by John Krasinski, who I loved in The Office and will forever identify with The Office, but does a great job as Jack Ryan in this particular writing of the character. It's more action oriented intentionally than the books are written. Um, he's more of a field officer, it turns out, than it was in the books, in the Clancy books. But we found it very interesting writing, very good writing, very tense. It does draw you in. You want to know what's going to happen next. You know that Jack's going to make it out, but how is he going to make it out? Who else is not going to make it out? That sort of thing. So if you're into that type of genre, highly, and you have Amazon Prime, highly recommend the series Jack Ryan.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm glad you recommend it. I'm going to move to an HBO series. In my Critics Corner, it's the HBO series The Gilded Age. Now, this is set in the late 19th century. It centers on the Russell family. Now, the Russell family is headed up by George Russell. Now, George Russell was played by Morgan Spector. You when you watch this, you're going to notice his voice. He does a lot of voiceovers in Hollywood and elsewhere. He's got that voice for voiceovers, and so he has that commanding voice of a corporate executive, which is what he plays here. In fact, a railroad magnate in this, with dreams of extending the railroad line all the way across the country. In this third series, this episode series, we're in our third season now. He's trying to expand his railroad empire across the nation. And getting it financed is going to be quite a challenge. And that's where he's at now. We're in the middle of the third season right now. Now, his wife is Bertha, played by actress Carrie Coon, and she does a wonderful job because Bertha's goal is to make her family the top of the pecking order in society, the cultural society of New York City in the late 19th century. They're the new money, okay, coming in. The railroad was the new money at that time. Now, across the street from them in another mansion is old money. I won't get into details here, but there's a great storyline of two sisters who are uh, in an old family with old money and get into all sorts of complications there. Also, they look closely at their service staff, the lives that they lead, the people who serve these rich people, and that's very. In fact, one of the members of the service staff comes up with an invention, and one of the people in the family tries to help him along to get it patented, and someone actually buy off onto this invention that he has made. There's another plot line there that I found even more fascinating. It's an African American family. Again, this is the 19th century. Slavery has only been eliminated for a few decades at that point. And there's a family headed up by a man who had been a slave, came to New York City, became a pharmacist, and owns his own pharmacy in the African American area of New York City. And they are, if there is a Gilded Age for African Americans, he was part of that. And how he was shunned actually because he was a former slave. The people who were in New York City and part of that black culture, if you will, before the end of slavery, kind of looked down on the slaves that were successful, which I found interesting. And it apparently does dovetail some of the history there. So very good plot lines, great writing, gorgeous sets. The sets and the costuming is so good. I mean, that alone is a reason to watch this series. But the script writing is terrific. The direction is terrific. I do not give very many items, whether movies or TV series or TV shows. I don't give out too many A pluses. I give The Gilded Age an A plus. It is a terrific series, and I'm only halfway through this third season, and I do think this is the best of the 3 seasons, and they are all Very good. So that's my Critics Corner. Any thoughts on that?
It's a very interesting time in American history during that period. And like you said, there are several different uh, spokes that it could go, and it appears to be going in those directions, talking about the African American issues with people who were free men from birth versus slave, and the new money versus old money, which we still have today. So it's interesting.
Duncan, there are two things we got to do before we go to our top five list. Number one, you're wearing a shirt. Those of us who are watching on video, what in the world is that you have on your shirt?
This past year, uh, Kim and I went down to the Keys, drove down to the Keys. We drove down to the Keys, and one of the places that we found was a restaurant called Mangrove Mike's. And Kim actually had this shirt made for me because they didn't sell polos like this um, for Mangrove Mike's, because we enjoyed the entire experience. It's a hole in the wall place, but the food was fabulous. The owner was great. The servers were great, and so we really liked that. But this is their actual emblem. They have a shark. They have a shark out front where you can put your head in or body part in if you want to. It's just a great, quirky place down in the Keys that we actually loved.
And for those who can't see it, it's a skull. That's why I asked about it. So, okay. I mean, Jane and I like to go to the Keys as well. It's a fun place to go, especially in wintertime when you're trying to get away from the winter weather. Also, Duncan, I just wanted to mention to people who cannot see this, if they're listening on only, that this is the second week in a row you have a beach cabana.
Yeah, we decided to extend our stay at the beach. Actually, just didn't have time to. Some things were going on before the podcast, so I didn't have time to switch around the background. So that's my bad. We'll have a different one next week if we can get away from the beach. But we both love the beach, so it's going to be tough.
Okay, Duncan, it's time for the top five list, and it is your turn.
Okay, the top five list today. I talked to my last top five about working for the Pacers. Well, before I worked for the Indiana Pacers as a 14-year-old, I spent a season with the World Hockey Association Indianapolis Racers as a stick boy. And that's exactly what the title was. I was the visiting team stick boy. So I got to deal with, all the players that were, the legend, the Bobby Hulls, the Gordie Howes. I dealt and worked with all of them. So this is my list of why working for the Pacers was better than working for the Indianapolis Racers hockey team, a youth. And we're talking 14, 15 years old. My number five reason, the Indiana Pacers trainer, David Craig, was one of the best bosses I ever had. David was the trainer for the Pacers for the ABA days, NBA days, into the early 2000s. I mean, he was there forever. Great guy, great boss, knew what to handle. So loved working for him. Learned a lot of life lessons from him. Number four reason. When David asked me if I wanted to jump from the Racers to the Pacers, I thought about it for about 30 seconds. And my thought process was basically, and again, young teenager, I can deal with 20 guys with skates, heavy equipment, ice, things of that nature. Or I can deal with 12 guys who basically have pretty skimpy uniforms, socks, things of that nature. Yeah, let me jump to the Pacers. I'll do that. That was my thought process at the time. So that was the number four reason why it was better. Number three reason. The Pacers may have not had any money, but we never sold Wayne Gretzky to another team. I was gone by that time from the Racers to the Pacers. But dear God, if people don't know, Wayne Gretzky started his professional hockey career as an Indianapolis Racer. And then, as I like to say, Nelson freaking Scalabania sold him to the Edmonton Oilers, and they went on to the NHL instead of the Racers. Racers probably wouldn't have gone on to the NHL because of Scalabania's money troubles, but you sold Wayne Gretzky. I won't even get into the fact we had Mark Messier and released him.
Hey,
Um,
can I tell you a quick story about Scalabania? Because, anybody who's a hockey fan in Indianapolis of any age will remember this guy. But Scalabania was invited to go on radio. Okay, he went on a the biggest radio sports talk show in town at the time. WIBC had a man named Jerry Baker, who's
mhm.
kind of retired now. Jerry was well known around town. Did
Was the
Pacer.
man. Yeah.
He was like one of the top, and he had this talk show. And I did radio talk shows, and you had a panic button. Somebody said something and said a bad word, you push the button so that because you're on a tape delay and it wouldn't go out over the air. So Scalabania was on this talk show, and you can kind of hear they have a little recording they put on every time. When David Letterman had a radio show, he called it the jerk alarm. Push the button and somebody said something they shouldn't say. Well, Scalabini is on there talking to some lady who's called in, and they push the button. I can tell. I'm thinking, oh, this lady said something. And as soon as they came back live, she goes, "Mr. Scalabini, how dare you talk to me like that?" So it was They bleeped their guest. Now I did a lot of talk shows. I never bleep my guest. I want to bleep people calling in, but that's my Nelson Scalabania story. So please
Yeah.
continue.
My mom, well, just to give you an aside on that, my mom, when she asked me when I first started working for him, she goes, how do you like working for the hockey team? I said, well, Mom, I've heard all the cuss words before. I've never heard them all in one sentence. That's what this job has started me out as. My number two reason was that that while working for the Pacers, I never had to worry about the Soviet security men chasing me around when we played the Russian national team. Now, here's the story on that one. We found out through the grapevine that when the Russian players came in, this was before the 1980 Olympics. And so they had a lot of pins, Makba pins, Russian, the little pins you see that the athletes get. Now they sell them, but back then it was only for the athletes. They like to trade them for patches. Well, one of the family, one of my dad's best friends and great family friend owned a laundry company, and they did a lot. They had tons of different patches. So my dad loaded me up with all these patches, and I was actively in one of the rooms trading patches. Once the players found out I had patches after the game, they were coming to me, and we were trading patches for pins and things of that nature. Idiot that I am, being a young kid, one kid wanted to trade me my Racers polo shirt for a jersey, and I said no because I was afraid that my boss with the Racers would have been upset with me. He actually was like yelling at me, "You didn't make that trade?" I'm sorry. But apparently the security men, I don't know whether they were, KGB or whoever they were for Russian security, found out what I was doing and were literally trying to figure out where I was to make me stop, or I don't know what they were going to do to me. But the players were giving me heads up. It was quite the cat and mouse game. And I knew every nook and cranny of Market Square Arena by that time, so I wasn't too worried about it.
It's interesting. I've heard stories about the KGB agents that would accompany sports teams when they would travel in the United States. The story I got was that they would always give the least competent KGB agents that, that
Yeah,
they would give
and
them
I
that.
apologize for the noise in the background. Our automatic vacuum, our robot vacuum's programmed to go off, and she is.
Well, we can
My
hear
number
your.
one reason
Go ahead. Let's get
for
you're in.
going that was better to be a ball boy with the Pacers than a stick boy with the Racers is the fact that nobody from the NBA ever checked me into the boards while I was walking out before a game. Literally, a player for the Houston Aeros, who the team that Gordie Howe and his sons played on, a guy named Larry Lund, apparently thought it would be funny while I was walking out on the very slick ice, holding onto the railing like the coach was, like the trainer and equipment manager, where I was following them because I was working the bench with them, literally came and checked me into the boards.
Now, for those who don't know
I
what
fall
checking is,
down.
tell them what checking is if they don't know
Yeah,
what that
I
is.
fall down. I get up. He's skating around and just laughing hysterically, thinks it's the greatest thing ever.
Now, checking means he basically pushed him up against the board. How should I put it? Not nicely.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that was my top five list for this week.
Oh my God, that was a good one. That was a very. Now I don't know if my best story I ever had. I was doing a radio talk show and I knew a guy that worked for the Racers in their first season, and he gave me a hockey stick that had been used by Andy Brown. I don't think Brown was there when
Yep.
you were there. He was. Well, Andy Brown. There's a great story behind him because he was the only professional goaltender that I ever knew that refused to wear a mask, which I thought was totally nuts. So finally, I asked somebody who worked for the Racers. I said, "Would you please explain to me why Andy Brown refuses to wear a mask?" He just looked at me and said, "Well, we all have to have a gimmick." And that was his gimmick. But he got chosen for the first year that the Racers were in play in Indy. He got chosen for the WHA All-Star team, and I think the main reason he was is because he didn't wear a mask and he was a novelty item.
Yeah, Andy was a great character, great guy, great guy. But yeah, that was one of his things. He would not wear a mask. It was a point of personal pride, even when we pointed out to him, don't you like your face? Um, you know, you're a decent and handsome guy, but that was his choice.
Well, thank you, Duncan. Hey, great top five. I hope you enjoyed our podcast today. If all goes well, we will be back next week for another Lannan and Giles Unscripted.